My name is Aaron Ortiz. For those who haven't joined us for the first two meetings, I'm a stormwater specialist here, compliance specialist for WGR Southwest. My specialty is the industrial general stormwater permit. And I love doing these workshop classes because it gives me a chance to be able to give just a basic overview of the general permit, how people get in those compliance, because they're required to do permit training. And this kind of, again, it's truncated and it's really a lot less than my normal training would be, but it covers everything needed so that you can get that training requirement checked off on your list. I look forward to spending time with you today. In reference to the previous part, I know that when we went through it pretty fast, a lot of information in the last part two, and there are a lot of questions, so feel free to forward those to us if you still have lingering questions from that, and we'll get to those questions as soon as we can. So we got another 2 minutes or so left, so I just want to again remind you that parts 1 and 2, as Rebecca said, will be on the website in 24 to 48 hours. Besides PowerPoints, I also created a certificate that you can download and fill out. So that way, if you don't have a chance to get that receipt from the website, you can also use that certificate as proof of training, and you'll have a PowerPoint handout to go with that. So that way, everything you need to make sure you get the training in.
And I will link that resource in the chat so you can go download the workshop handouts and also the certificate. So look for the chat in that link.
Well, I think we're just about ready to start. I'm not sure if you guys can all see my screen, but if you look at that picture in the background, that was a spot where we did some filming, and it's actually quite a beautiful spot. That's all sand dunes with built-up growth, and it was just quite beautiful. One side we could see the water coming in towards the ocean, and then we turned around, you can actually see the rolling ocean, and it was quite a view. Well, it's 11 o'clock and time to start the presentation. So again, my name is Aaron Ortiz. For those who just joined us, I'm with WGR Southwest, Stormwater Compliance Specialist. And this is part 3 of our presentation. This workshop is going to review some different sampling situations and recommendations on how to collect compliant samples. If part 1 is the what of the IGP, in other words, what's IGP all about, why am I doing this? And part 2 is, okay, now what am I expected to do? Okay, this third workshop is designed to kind of help you understand techniques or recommendations for grabbing samples. WGR, in association with the Water Board, helps you create a sampling guidance video. Again, this is not a absolute thing because everybody has unique situations, but it gives you recommendations and guidance on how to grab certain things, how to approach the sampling. So what my job here to do is kind of give you some tips, some recommendations, because I've had different situations with different clients that have different unique opportunities. Some people grabbing samples are real easy, and for some it's a real challenge. So this kind of to give you some ideas, give you some recommendations. One thing I will say, one of the things the permit requires, especially for oil and grease, is you're supposed to collect samples directly into the bottle that goes to the laboratory. So oil and grease, usually the amber bottle with the preservative in it, the acid, whether it's sulfuric acid solution or HCl. Either way, if at all possible, to the extent feasible, you're supposed to grab a sample directly into the bottle that goes to the lab. So many times for a client, if they have a lot of sheet flow, I recommend that you'll see some recommendations where we say to help mitigate that. Okay, so let's get started. A quick overview of the training. We're going to talk about the goals of the workshop. We're going to talk about some representative sampling. I'm going to give you some tips on smart sampling, and then we're going to, it's about a 15-minute video from the Water Board, which is really good about kind of going over and giving some demonstrations of recommendations we have. Then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. All right. What is the goal of this workshop? Okay, well, the Industrial General Permit gives, which we refer to as the IGP, gives guidance in attachment H, okay? In the open paragraph of H, it says that it's the US EPA's Industrial Stormwater Monitoring and Sample Guide, which came out in 2009. And the guide basically gives you guidance on how to collect samples and recommendations for collecting samples. For the sake of time, given in this 1 hour format, we're going to give you some quick general tips and recommendations for performing compliant IGP sampling, followed by the instruction video that the Water Board put out, okay? So let's take a look at that. First of all, our first recommendation is don't shoot yourself in the foot, okay? How you take samples and the way you take samples can affect your samples. If you sample carelessly or not thinking through on it, you can cause yourself problems. The whole point is to get a representative sample, okay? The samples aren't supposed to be cleaner than represents what's coming out of your property. In other words, you're not grabbing it from the tap, which I hope not, but you're actually grabbing samples that come from industrial areas that represent the water leaving your property. But neither do you want to create for yourself problems, okay? So let's talk about that a little bit, okay? So Section 2.2 of the EPA guide describes the representative sample as discharges prior to the stormwater leaving your facility at a location downstream from all your industrial materials and activities. The reason behind requiring such a location is that the sample is representative of your facility's discharge, taking into account the types of pollutants that may be contained in runoff from that property. Okay, now let me put it in English. A representative sample should reflect the quality and quantity of your facility's stormwater discharges. So if you have water leaving your property, it needs to really represent what you do and how you do it. And so the water board or the permit allows for you to do where you can get a sample of several areas. You can do combined samples where you grab samples from each outfall and they combine them together, which I find you can do, but for most facilities, I'd rather just grab separate samples because then you can get better averages that way. And then there are times where you can actually do a representative sample, say this water, this outfall represents this whole area. But if you do representative sampling, you have to make sure that the surfaces, the industrial activities, and the BMPs are all virtually identical. Okay, so that's very hard to do. So smart sampling starts with planning ahead. Have an understanding that the IGP requires in terms of monitoring. Okay, and then we talked about Section 2, kind of goes over the monitoring, so take a look at that. Okay. Oh, by the way, also the video that's coming, it was actually created for people with my certification QUISPs. Okay, so it's to help QUISPs get an idea of recommendations the water board has for them to make recommendations to other people. However, the information was so straightforward and really good that we decided it's really good for anybody to take a look at. That's why we're presenting it here. You should have a compliant stormwater pollution prevention plan, which includes monitoring, a monitoring section. And your MIP should include descriptions of what you're sampling for and where your sampling locations are. So we call it MIP, the Monitoring Implementation Plan. I refer to it as a MIP for short, okay? You should have an account with an ELAP certified laboratory. So that's one thing. In other words, it needs to be a laboratory that's been certified to have an acceptable level of quality control in their sampling testing process. Have your sample bottles and equipment ready before your wet season starts. So if you haven't got your bottles ready, now's the time. As you saw, we had that storm about a week ago come in and surprise all of us, and it was a surprise. I actually have one client that actually collected a sample. So you want to make sure that now's the time to prepare. Now's the time to get your BMPs in place. Now's the time to make sure that everybody's getting trained. Now's the time to make sure you have your paperwork in order. Did I mention now's the time? Have a partially filled out chain of custody. In other words, what we do is things that don't change, like your address and contact information and what you're sampling for. If that doesn't change, you should probably have that all pre-filled out. We recommend having that pre-filled out on your chain of custody form, especially if you have a lab that allows you to send your own chain of custody as long as you're compliant. Those are good to have. As previously stated, smart sampling starts with planning ahead. Give yourself every chance of having a positive sampling result by installing BMPs before the rain starts. So I would recommend trying to find ways to keep water from leaving your property in the first place. If you remember Section 2, we talked about discharge is water or fluid leaving your property. If you can, remember, this is a surface water permit. Water leaving your property with it either through a point of discharge or through a storm drain system that goes to leave your property, which is a point of discharge. that you, if you can hang on to your water and let it soak into the ground, that's not a discharge under the general permit, okay? So if you can make ponds, now again, you don't necessarily have to create a pond that meets the treatment control criteria of an 85th percentile 24-hour size pond. You know, we talked about that last time. But even so, even little ponds, even a series of little ponds, anything to help slow water down, so that smaller storms to stay on site and soak into the ground, which the water board likes because we're trying to rebuild that water table. You know, we've been in a drought, and anywhere we can capture water and soak it into the ground and rebuild that water table, even better. Berms, you can keep water in there. Vegetative swales, which are a great option. Anything you can do to capture and get that water to stay on property and soak in rather than have it leave is a great option. Reducing stormwater discharges is one of the advanced BMPs listed in the IGP, okay? And basically it states the following concerning discharge reduction. These include BMPs that divert, infiltrate, reuse, contain, retain, or reduce the volume of stormwater runoff. Dischargers are encouraged to utilize BMPs that infiltrate or reuse stormwater where feasible. So that is right out of the permit. And they say, okay, listen, you don't have room to build an 85th percentile 24-hour storm size pond, you know, one that where it has to be certified by an engineer and be labeled as a treatment control BMP. But with that being said, still you can do something. Smaller ponds, water garden, you know, rain gardens, vegetative swales, things that where you can capture smaller storms, keep them soaking into the ground, so that we can kind of keep the water table to a certain degree, you know, get it recharged. And they really do encourage that for two reasons. One, recharge the water table, but two, also any minor pollutants that might be on site will probably be captured by your soil, and so it'll help reduce pollutants that wash off to the rivers and streams if you get capture on site. So remember from part 2 of the IGP Basics workshop, if you were part of that, you only need to sample if there's a discharge, okay? If there is no discharge, you are not required to sample. So if you have small ponds or whatever else, and they do have a tendency to capture water and water doesn't leave your property, then you don't have to sample. Now, with that being said, you definitely want to document that because there are some third parties that are accusing people of not sampling when they should. So you want to basically document whenever a rain comes. I would recommend having a rain gauge on site, but also basically during business hours, especially when it rains heavy, just kind of maybe take a picture or just kind of make a note that, hey, observations were done, no water discharging from the property, just so that you have a form of insurance against these third parties who like to prey on people. If you have sheet flow, consider installing something to direct and capture your runoff, such as berms to direct the flow, or using a utility box as a sump to collect the flow. I don't remember we mentioned that, especially when it comes to oil and grease, you're supposed to collect the water directly to the oil and grease bottle that goes to the lab. Well, a good alternative is to get something like a utility box, where if you can direct the water to flow over that, you can put that in the ground, and then when it's time to grab a sample, and you see you have enough flow to collect the sample, remember we talked about QSEs in the previous training, pull the cover off so that the water drops down into it, then you have maneuvering room for your bottle where you can get your bottle in there and grab your sample, okay? The good thing about these utility boxes is they're permeable in the bottom. So once you're done collecting your sample and you have all your water, you don't want to collect sample from the water sitting in the sump. You want to collect sample from water running into that sump. Grab your sample and then put the lid back on so it's covered when not used to protect from being a trip hazard. And so it gives you maneuvering room for your bottle, okay? Now the pictures below show a client we have that use a berm to direct their stormwater flow to a utility box where they can capture a representative sample. So see, they already had some of berming at another area. They just basically laid down a berm that they glued to the ground, and it redirected water to a utility box where now when the water is flowing over the top of the utility box and you can see what's leaving the property, they pop the lid open, we're able to get the bottle in there and catch that flow going into that, and then they put the lid back on. And they really get some really positive samples because it represents, again, it's representative samples. They're grabbing samples that represent water leaving their property, and they're doing it in a compliant manner. We call it something called the legal flush. Remember, the general permit allows for up to 4 hours during business hours or within 2 hours prior to the business hours for sample collection. Okay, so again, if you missed part 2, you really need to see part 2 of my training, because a lot of this references here, you won't really understand unless you see part 2. But basically, if you remember, discharge is water or flow in 48 hours. You have to have 48 hours since your last discharge ended, and flow, you have to have a flow to grab a sample. So if you have a QSC, if you have a qualified storm event, you have up to 4 hours to collect that sample. Or if rain started the night before, you within the previous 12 hours, you have up to 4 hours from the start of business to grab that sample. Again, we went into more detail on the previous training. So as a general rule, you do not attempt to collect your samples in the first 5 minutes that will qualify and discharge. Okay. Again, you're not trying to cheat the system, but you want a representative sample. It's not cleaner than usual, but also not dirtier, because all around you are businesses. There's agriculture out here. There's freeways. There's other businesses. All their activities go to the air and they land on your property. And the first flush, the legal flush that comes out first, the first wash off, is some of your activity. Granted, yes, but there is a lot of other activity around you that you have nothing to do with, that's washing down on your stormwater and going down the storm drain. And if you grab, as soon as the discharge starts, if you're out there within 5 minutes of discharge, you grab a sample, I guarantee you, you're grabbing a non-representative sample to a certain degree, because it's your water plus everybody around you's, their contribution to your water. So if at all possible, and I know it's not always possible, but if you can let the discharge happen, not just rain, but discharge happen for a little bit, enough to where you can get everybody else's contaminants washed off your property, then collect your sample. And if you have up to 4 hours, you have a sample. So for example, let's just say rain starts and you're in the middle of a project and you cannot pull away, and you see the rain's heavy enough for flow, and say flow, your Monday through Friday is 7 to 4. That's a good generic thing. And around noon, rain hits and you have flow. And by the time you get done, you get out there to grab a sample, the rain stops and the flow stops. And you're like, oh, darn, I missed it. But then 2 hours later, the rain picks up again. Okay, as long as you're within that 4 hour window and you have flow, you can grab that sample. So be vigilant. When discharge starts, you do want to get out there if at all possible and grab a sample, after a few minutes and letting everybody else's junk wash off your property. If you can give it half an hour, great, but it depends. But if you're not able to get that sample because you just can't pull away from a critical project, or I get it. Sometimes you're in the middle of something where if you leave it, it can be catastrophic. So you can't leave. I get that. Okay. But if at all possible, go over there and grab a sample and as soon as you have a qualified storm event, and give it just a little time for wash off. Okay. But again, if it starts and stops and it starts again, as long as within that 4 hour window, either for the start of discharge during business hours or within the first 4 hours of the start of business, if it happened that the discharge started the night before, grab that sample. Okay. Because that's representative. Do not overfill your sample bottles, which have preservatives. So whenever possible, especially like I mentioned, oil and grease that has acid in it, preservative. Also, different types of things, metals. They usually have nitric acid, which is, by the way, you really do need to tuberculose because that's acid. Just different types of bottles have preservative, and you want to make sure that you don't want to flush out preservative out. So when you fill your bottle, try not to overflow the bottle, especially that has preservatives. When it comes to things like total suspended solids, it really doesn't matter because there are no preservatives for solids. So if you fill up a TSS bottle and it overflows, well, that's no big deal because there's no preservatives to be washed out. Okay. Again, you have to have enough rain. Remember what we said about QSEs? You have to have flow and 48 hours since the last discharge. So don't have scrape or gouge the bottom or the sides of a drain if the rain is not enough to where you can actually get a flow to where you can grab a sample. And again, this is a judgment call on your part. If there's a lot of flow and you say, oh, well, I don't have enough, well, you know what? Then you could get in trouble because you're really not grabbing a sample when you could. But there are genuine times where the rain is just not enough and you have a trickle and there's just no way you're going to be able to grab a sample without scraping and gouging and collecting and dislodging a lot of solids that you would normally dislodge in a normal sampling event. You don't want to dirty the water by stirring up solids or anything else that's embedded in that ground, okay? So the best thing is make sure you have flow, don't scrape or gouge, just get in there and collect your sample. And that's all we recommend putting in like a utility box. That way you don't have to do anything other than maneuver the bottle down and capture the flow. You want to avoid contaminating your sample by doing the following. Only use clean collection equipment and sample bottles, okay? You want to store your stuff in a place where it's clean location. So in other words, store it in a room where there's running machinery, or especially where there's exhaust, or where you have chemicals and stuff that are airborne. Not a good idea. You want to store it someplace where you know there's not a likelihood that there's going to be some sort of contaminant that's going to be able to contaminate your bottles. You want to use nitrile or other type of protective gloves, preferably nitrile, I think. And you might want to change them between locations, especially if you have very sensitive, especially if you're looking for mercury that's really sensitive, then you really want to replace everything. Because gloves have a twofold thing. One, they protect you from the samples, but also protect the samples from being contaminated by you. You don't want to do any smoking or eating or drinking while you're sampling. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, because you just don't know what's in stormwater. I've collected stormwater samples that and people I'm with know have things in that water that are just totally disgusting. And you don't know what's in stormwater. You never know what's in stormwater. With animal populations out there, also, unfortunately, with a lot of homeless and other folks who may not necessarily be discreet in where they leave things behind, just other folks in general. There could be a lot of things in stormwater that are just not good. So protect yourself. Please wear gloves. Just as a safety factor, okay? You don't want to collect samples near a running vehicle. You want to avoid collecting around parked vehicles that are, if possible. Years ago, I was at a facility. I was doing an annual evaluation in May, and the freak storm came through. And because we'd had a drought year, that they had flow. So while I was there doing the annual evaluation in May, which is kind of late in the season, they still had one more sample they're supposed to collect. So they went to go collect the sample. So since I was there, I helped them. And they were by an alpha near parked cars, and there was oil machines coming from those cars because there was leaky cars. So they had to do some response, and they had to do some things, and they responded very well. And their numbers came out fine because they responded to this before the grease reached the drain. They put in some drain protection, and the numbers were fine. Okay, but if you can collect the sample away from running cars, so you don't contaminate your sample, away from any kind of sources, that'd be best. Okay, don't breathe, sneeze, cough, or any direction of an open container. Oh, by the way, you don't want to open the container until you're actually collecting the sample. When the containers come from the lab, that's kind of a tip. I'll often kind of just make sure that the caps are on snug, because those containers are pre-sterilized, and you want to keep them closed and away from contaminants. And then when you grab a sample, you keep them closed until you're actually in the process of opening that and grabbing that sample. And then as soon as you're done, collect it, okay? Once you collect your sample, you need to put them on ice, whether it's blue ice or preferably just regular ice, because you need to keep it at 4 degrees Celsius, okay? So when you grab a sample and you collect it and you put it in a container, put it on ice. I have a client who's literally around the corner from their lab. And so they grab a sample and they put their samples on ice, and they get to the lab, and the lab says, oh, your samples are too warm. Well, they're actually colder than what they were collected, but because they're on the corner, they still can't get to the point where they like it. But that's not their fault. It's because they're really close to the lab. So in 2019, the Water Board created a training video, which I referenced earlier, which is a stormwater sampling and field guide, to give qualified industrial stormwater practitioners, people with my certification, some general guidance on approaches to collecting a representative stormwater sample for the general permit, compliance analytical sampling. Okay, so WGR, we were the ones that helped the Water Board with creating this training video. Okay, there are some assumptions which you need to understand. Okay, in this video, they're assuming that the people watching this video understand the general permit requirements, since the video was created for QUISPs. Okay, so you need to have a good understanding of the general permit and what it requires. So that's why if you haven't done sections 1 and 2 of this training, you really should. It'll help you be more equipped to better apply what you're going to see in these videos. However, that being said, the information is really good, and the water board is giving us permission. It's public domain. It's on YouTube to be able to watch it, and I highly recommend that you do. Okay, so I'm gonna try to do a little technical scary stuff here. I'm gonna try to switch over and put on the video, and we're gonna watch the training video now. Cross your fingers. Here we go.
When it comes to collecting stormwater samples, there are compliant techniques and not so compliant techniques that you can use to get the job done. Hi, I'm Shuka Rastagarpur with the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Resources Control Board, and in this video we hope to give you, the qualified industrial stormwater practitioner, some guidance and practical tips for collecting representative stormwater samples.
I'm Brandon Rosenboom, also with the Division of Water Quality at the State Water Resources Control Board. Many times, collecting a representative sample is a combination of good planning and adapting to current conditions. The goal of this video is not to give you a stormwater sampling manual, but rather to share important concepts that will help you think on your feet and collect a representative sample out in the real world.
Yes, every facility is different, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach. What you see in this video might work for one facility and not another. Try to see past the specific examples and look for the underlying concepts which apply to each facility.
Before we get started though, this video is not intended to be a stormwater sampling crash course. There are a few things that we are expecting you to know. As a QUISP, you should have a working knowledge of the California Water Board's Industrial General Permit and its sampling requirements. The facility you are working with should also have a compliant SWIP in place with a description of the facility's discharge points, sampling locations, and the required sampling parameters.
You should also have a working relationship with an analytical laboratory that is part of the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, also known as ELAP. You should have a sample kit with the correct number and types of laboratory supplied sample containers for the facility. Furthermore, you should know how to fill out the chain of custody form and determine how the samples will be delivered to the lab within the appropriate holding times. You should also be familiar with the discharge characteristics of the facility, the time constraints for sampling storm events, and how many sampling events are required. Also, you should research and know any exceptions to the sampling requirements, such as unsafe conditions, outside of facility operating hours, and such. But requirements can change with time, so make sure you check with the current industrial general permit.
Think through the facility operating hours and make sure a sampler is ready to respond during normal operating hours. So, why do we collect stormwater samples? What are we trying to determine?
The California Water Board's Industrial General Permit requires each facility operator to sample stormwater runoff discharging from their property in order to gauge the effectiveness of their pollution prevention program and best management practices.
And because these stormwater samples are evaluating the facility's effectiveness at preventing or removing pollutants, they should be representative. What does representative mean? Well, a representative sample gives an unbiased snapshot of stormwater quality associated with the facility's industrial activity.
A representative sample should not be the cleanest water you can find, and it also shouldn't be the dirtiest. You can think of a representative sample as reflecting the average quality of the facility's stormwater runoff. When, where, and how a sample is collected can greatly impact how representative it is. And be careful about run-on from neighboring sites and from non-industrial areas.
Most of the time, the location for collecting a representative sample will be determined ahead of time by the QUISP and should be reliable. But in the field, things can change. High water levels mean the original sampling location can be unsafe, or maybe water from the neighbor's property has backed up into your discharge point. You must be able to adapt, come up with a plan B, and still collect a representative sample. Stormwater samples are collected in order to get a realistic assessment of how well a stormwater management program is performing.
Ready to start? In this video, we are going to look at 3 very common sampling scenarios and talk through some approaches to collecting samples for each one.
Don't forget your sampling equipment, which may include a sample kit, drain grate hook, sample boom, chain of custody form, and pH meter. If you're going to be in traffic areas, bring some traffic cones too, but the exact equipment you need will be dependent on site-specific sampling logistics.
Let's check out our first scenario, sheet flow.
One of the most common and challenging types of stormwater discharge to sample is sheet flow. Sheet flow is when stormwater doesn't collect in a ditch or channel, but runs off across the surface of a facility in a thin sheet.
Here, it looks like we have someone trying to grab a sheet flow sample using a dustpan, but it's not working out. Right about now, he is probably wishing he could make a low spot in the pavement. Let's think about this. Does this sample look representative of the water leaving his property? What about all the dirt he stirred up digging that hole?
This is definitely not the best way to collect a representative sheet flow sample. Let's go back and see what he did wrong. First of all, it looks like he is using a dustpan to try and collect his sample. Although this may sound like a reasonable way to collect a sample, the analytical method used for testing oil and grease does not allow water samples to be transferred from container to container, or the result may be biased low. This extends to the sample collection. No intermediate containers or sample collection devices may be used to collect an oil and grease sample. Dustpans, pitchers, or plastic bags are not allowed. The oil tends to stick to the sides of the intermediate containers, removing it from the sample and causing inaccurate analytical results.
If you're using automatic samplers, things get a little complicated. We're not going to get into the details of using auto samplers in this video, but you should know that auto samplers must be specifically designed to handle parameters like oil and grease and pH. Another problem is that he is contaminating the stormwater sample by stepping in the water that he is sampling. The sample collector should always stand downstream or out of the water flow if possible.
Our sampler then digs a hole in the nearby gravel and then uses his dustpan to collect the water. It turns out he's onto something here, but this is definitely the wrong approach. The sediment disturbed by digging ends up in his stormwater sample. That is not representative of what was flowing off his site. And he's still using the dustpan, so sorry pal.
Now, we asked the quiz to look at the sampling location and suggest a better way to collect stormwater samples without breaking the bank or installing any major modifications. This is what she came up with.
But remember, although this is a better sampling solution for a particular discharge point, it might not work at your facility. Pay attention to the concepts used here, not the specifics.
When the QUISP saw this sampling location, she saw the need for two things. First, some sort of low spot must be installed to allow the sample bottles to be filled directly, without using a secondary container. This problem was solved by installing a small underground pull box at the sampling location. The pull box is deep enough to accommodate the sample bottles. When not collecting samples, the lid is left closed, and the stormwater flows over the pull box and discharges off-site. Second, the flow must be increased or concentrated in some way to make it easier to collect the sample.
Whenever you are collecting samples, it is important to pay attention to your safety. Many times, your sample collection point might be in a vehicle or equipment traffic area. Not a great place to be working close to the ground. Make sure you are visible, and if possible, use the buddy system.
Personal protective equipment is also important. Sampling usually involves cold weather conditions, slippery surfaces, caustic chemicals, and dirty water. Make sure you're wearing appropriate clothing and footwear and use powder-free gloves and eye protection when handling stormwater or sample bottles. Also, don't forget about other PPE that may be required by your facility.
Avoid smoking, eating, or drinking while collecting samples. Not only is it not safe, but there is a chance you can contaminate your sample.
Now, let's move on to our second scenario, drain inlets. Collecting representative stormwater samples from drain inlets can be challenging, especially if there is a drain insert bag or other BMP installed, like in this case.
It looks like our sampler here is struggling with the drain insert bag. Having drain insert bags installed at sampling locations is almost always a problem, because at any time the bag is disturbed, it releases trapped pollutants and sediment back into the stormwater and right into your sample bottle.
It looks like he's collecting a sample from the conveyance pipe at the bottom of the catch basin. Remember, looking for representative stormwater samples, and what our sampler did here was not the best way to capture a representative sample from a drain inlet. Let's see what he did wrong and find out what he could do better. The first problem that we see here is the facility has installed a drain bag at their sampling point. Drain bags can be great BMPs, but having one installed at your sample point can make it difficult to grab a representative sample, especially here where it looks like the holding straps have become weathered and brittle. Remember, samples should be collected after the BMP, which in this case results in a bunch of sediment being released and flowing right where he is collecting his sample.
The second problem is that our sampler is not using good sampling technique. It looks like there is not a lot of flow in this drain, so he is scraping the bottom of the catch basin to fill up his sample bottle. This is not a representative sample because he is stirring up and sampling whatever material might have been lying at the bottom of this catch basin, which may contain pollutants left over from years past, or may have come from non-industrial sources. At any rate, it is not representative of the water leaving the facility, and if there is any preservative in the laboratory supplied sample bottle, he lost it while scraping the bottom of the catch basin and disqualified the sample. Unfortunately, these problems with sampling technique caused high analytical results, which were noticed by the water boards. The facility was inspected by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, who issued a notice of violation for inadequate sampling protocols and a non-compliance monitoring program. The facility contracted with a QUISP to respond to the violation. Let's see what the QUISP recommended for a better sampling setup.
In addition to more regular sweeping and good housekeeping, the QUISP recommended that the facility remove the drain insert bag and replace it with a drop-in filter unit with a sampling port. And after studying the facility's drainage system, the QUISP determined that the most representative sample from this drain inlet should come from the water flowing into the drain, not from the water flowing in the stormwater pipe down below.
This does two things. First, by installing a plastic drop-in filter with a sampling port, the BMP no longer has to be disturbed when collecting a sample. This means all of that sediment captured by the BMP will stay put until it can be cleaned and disposed of. Second, the drain insert funnels all of the water flowing into the drain through the filtration unit and out through a single opening in the bottom. This provides the sampler with a representative and post-BMP sample of the water flowing into the drain.
It is important to know where you should take the sample in the drain inlet. This depends on each particular drain and drainage system. In this case, the sampler collected samples from the drain line at the bottom of the catch basin, but because of possible commingling in the drain line, the QUISP determined a sample from the water flowing into the drain would be more representative.
Also, remember how the sampler was scraping the bottom of the catch basin while collecting the sample? This brings up a good point. You should never touch the sides or surface of the drain inlet with the sample bottle. You might contaminate the sample or break the glass bottle.
Don't forget about safety. Did you notice the traffic cones? If you're in an area with vehicle traffic, make sure you're visible.
Okay, let's move on to our last example, manholes.
Taking stormwater samples from a manhole is a little less complicated than sheet flow or drain inlet samples, but there are still a few things you need to consider.
It looks like he is using a sample boom, which is good. Keep in mind that manholes are confined spaces. You should never enter a manhole without a confined space entry permit and proper training.
But it looks like he's having trouble collecting a sample from the bottom of the manhole, so he is just filling up his bottle from that other pipe.
The problem is, we don't know where that pipe is coming from, and if he was supposed to collect a sample from the conveyance pipe, sampling from that other pipe is not a representative sample. Let's see how the QUISP approaches this situation.
After studying the facility's drainage system, the QUISP determined that the water from both lines was industrial stormwater runoff and that a representative sample should be taken after the water coming out of the pipe commingles with the water in the conveyance line. And in order to solve the low flow situation, the QUISP recommended that the facility install a weir inside the manhole, which should be epoxy to the side of the manhole to prevent leaks. The weir would cause the water to back up inside the line, eventually becoming deep enough to collect a sample with the sample bottle.
One thing to be aware of when installing a weir like this is that it changes when your facility discharges. Only collect samples after the water flows over the weir and any initially impounded water is cleared from the system. A system like this will also require maintenance. The area upstream of the weir will tend to fill up with sediment and other pollutants, and will need regular inspections and cleaning.
Okay, let's summarize. The purpose of this video is to give you general guidance, not an exhaustive sampling manual.
There are many things that we didn't cover about collecting stormwater samples, but that are important for you to know.
Make sure to read the current Industrial Journal permit, especially those sections relating to stormwater monitoring and sampling.
The most important thing that you should learn from this video is the concept of representative sampling. As a QUISP, you must look at the facility's drainage system and figure out the most representative sampling locations.
Collecting stormwater samples is not just about filling up bottles, it's about getting an accurate snapshot of the facility's stormwater quality. It determines the facility's public compliance story. The data informs future facility investments in BMPs, and high-quality statewide data helps inform the Water Board's future permit development. I'm Shuka with the State Water Board.
And I'm Brandon with the State Water Board.
Happy sampling.
Well, there you have it. Let me switch over to my other screen. Back to our things here. So, we had a couple of questions when the video was going, so let's take a look at the questions. I believe one was, Rebecca, I think one was concerning swales, where we can grab samples at the end of a swale, I believe.
Yes, so if there is a vegetative swell, can you sample after the swell?
It's a hearty yes, definitely. Now, as long as that's where water is leaving your property. Permit says you're supposed to grab a sample from the point at which water leaves. So if water enters a vegetative swell and goes through your discharge and leaves, that's where you want to grab that sample. Okay, and that's an ideal place to grab a sample because you've had all that vegetation helping to collect and filter, biofiltrate a lot of the pollutants. So one, you have infiltration into the ground. Two, you have biofiltration. And really, it's an ideal spot to collect the sample. And then I believe there was another question that came out, basically asking, I don't know if everybody could see me okay. Oh, there we go. A second question came out asking, why ice? Well, the permit wants you, according to the sampling guidance document, you're supposed to keep your samples at 4 degrees Celsius. And the best way to do that is to pack them on ice. Some people like to use blue ice. I find it's easier just to use standard wet ice to pack your samples. Now, if you say, for example, you collect samples and your hold time for those samples can be more than, for example, say you grab samples towards the end of a day, but the lab can't come to the next day to pick them up, you can get a dedicated refrigerator or a small ice box, as my mother-in-law used to say, and keep your samples in there. Now, again, I recommend it being a dedicated refrigerator because you don't want to mingle your stormwater samples with food of any kind, because you can have cross-contamination. Your food can contaminate the samples, and who knows is in that water. You don't want that getting anywhere near any kind of food you have. So if you do use a refrigerator of some sort, you definitely want to keep one as a dedicated refrigerator just for samples. And then when you get to the lab, if you have someone who from the lab picking it up, then you don't have to worry about ice because you're keeping them in a refrigerated ice machine, a refrigerator. However, if you need to transport them to the lab, or if your lab's kind of picking them up and you don't have a refrigerator, you want to put them in an ice chest and you put them on ice to keep them at that 4 degrees Celsius requirement. Because the lab, when they receive samples, they check one of the things they check right away is the temperature of your samples. So you want to make sure you keep it on ice. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions, Rebecca, we can answer for people? We have plenty of time.
Let's see here. We have a comment that says, be cautious that the sample bottle label doesn't dissolve in the ice water. Helps to pack your ice in Ziploc bags and put that in the cooler with the sample bottles. That's
true. That's true. Most of my labels are usually okay, but that's just a safe precaution. That's a good suggestion. I like that.
And we have a comment that says, can the lid or cap of the oil and grease preserve bottle be used to collect the sample?
That's a good question, but the water board may consider it a secondary container regardless. The permit states it's supposed to go directly into the bottle, Now, there are a few cases where they have underground conveyances, and basically, in order for them to completely collect a sample like that, they would have to spend a lot of capital to rearrange their sampling stuff. So, where it's not big enough for like a weir, like we showed on the video. So again, that's why they have, the permit has that language, to the extent feasible. What's feasible? If it's at all feasible, collect it directly into the bottle, not the cap. If you can't, if you have no other choice, if it's going to be too much of a capital expense to change your sampling setup, then collect as much as you can directly into the bottle. And then if you have to top it off, you can. But remember, that's not your choice. If at all possible, if it's at all feasible, you need to collect it directly into your oil and grease bottle that goes to the lab.
And we have a question. Do we need ice for sampling pH and turbidity?
pH, not really, because you're supposed to collect it with it. You're supposed to test it within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. But turbidity, also, I don't think so, because if you're doing your field turbidity testing, then again, it's done right there on the spot. Now, if you have turbidity done with the lab, then you might as well pack it with the rest of your samples. But if you do field testing, especially for pH and turbidity, then having them on ice is not a priority. But if you send them off to the lab, then you might as well pack it with the rest of them on ice. That's a good question. I actually never had that question before. That's good.
And is there any rule of thumb where to locate the sampling locations?
That's a great question. The permits are supposed to grab it from the last place that water leaves your property. Okay. So some people are really blessed in that everything goes to one spot and they can grab a sample from there. Some people have an unfortunate thing where they have like 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 places where water leaves your property. That's why I tell people, if you can ahead of time think through your process and see if you can't redirect some of your water so where you can kind of narrow the number of outfalls. Now, again, that's kind of a hard choice, but yeah, wherever water leaves your property, you're supposed to grab a sample from each one of those locations.
That seems like that's all the questions we have right now.
Well, yeah, we get this one was a little bit shorter because there's not a whole lot. I mean, we gave the tips and the video was really comprehensive. If you have any questions, since we have some time, if we have any questions based on the previous video, part 2, which we had earlier today, if you want to reintroduce those questions to the chat now that we couldn't get to earlier, I'd be more than happy your questions. More than happy to answer your questions.
And while we're waiting for questions to come on in, if you missed any part of this workshop, if you missed the first and second part of this 3-part series, you can find these on our website, which is stormwaterawareness.org. We'll have them posted on our recorded workshops page, and they should be up in about 24 to 48 hours. So you can find them there. And you can also see the other workshops that we have for today and for the remainder of the week. We have quite a few awesome ones, so you're going to want to go check out those workshops and make sure you register for them. And it looks like we're getting some questions in, Aaron. We have one that says, can you carry an extra sampling kit because you may drop a glass vessel?
No, can you? I think you should. Whenever I grab samples, I'll, as a precaution, I try to carry extra oil and grease bottles with me. Any kind of glass containers, especially. Sometimes you can open up a container and it slips out of your hand and gets contaminated. So it's always good to have some spare bottles or spare testing kits with you. So yeah, it's always a good idea.
And from Chris, we have a question that says, hold on, the chat's moving. How would you approach sampling constituents that are naturally occurring, such as CU and ZN? Also, every stormwater sample on the planet would have them present. When would you consider those constituents a pollutant or a potential pollutant at a site? A potential pollutant a site must sample for. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, let me see if I understand it correctly. We're basically saying if you have naturally occurring pollutants in the ground, iron, zinc, aluminum, which are naturally occurring, especially here in the valley, how would you approach something like that? Well, if you have industrial activity that has one of those pollutants, then you are required to sample for that, okay? 2, if you don't have industrial activities to sample for those, and they're not required by table 1 or in your industrial activities, then you don't sample for them. So for example, if you're not required to sample for iron and you don't have an industrial activity that has iron and your SIC code is not listed on table 1, or in other words, there's no compulsory reason for you to grab a sample, then I wouldn't collect a sample. Now, with that being said, sometimes you have to grab, especially if it's listed in table, if your SIC code, remember part 2 talked about this. If your SIC code requires you to collect samples and table 1 and iron is listed and you grab samples and you have high iron, and you're pretty sure it's coming from natural background, there's a couple of approaches. One is try to grab samples upstream of your outfall where water is coming from your industrial facility, to show that there's a balance between here's what we're producing and here's what the outfall. So if you can find the spot more representative than where you're grabbing now, so ask yourself the question first, is this truly representative of our discharge? Okay, for example, if I can grab a sample from one spot, but I know I'm getting outside influences, as opposed to if I grab samples from over here, and so I have to grab 2 samples, but yet together they are more representative than this one spot that's got commingling, I would consider going upstream and grabbing samples from those 2 spots that are more representative. Okay. 3, we had a sample, we have a client that had 2 parts of the facility, it's a landfill, and part of the facility was closed, capped, and non-active, but they still had an outfall in that area. And the other side of the facility had where the active activity was going on. And they collected samples and they went to level 2 for iron and aluminum. And we did a soil study. My office manager did an extremely excellent study of the soils, the geological surveys, and determined that basically the alluvial soils in our area are very high in iron, and to our surprise, they were high in aluminum as well. And we found that iron and aluminum were high in their samples. But we also looked at, because the permit says if your samples are causing, if your industrial activity is, or non-industrial activity is the sole cause of the exceedance. So if your background is contributing to it, but your industrial activity is contributing to it, then you can't really make the argument, hey, it's natural background because you're contributing to it. But in this case, we showed the area that was not active at all and had no industrial activity at all. It was all capped and closed. Their iron and aluminum, the numbers were about equivalent to the water in the active area. So we said, look, you have active area where the aluminum and iron are just as high in the unactive area. So the source is not from our client. It has to be coming from natural background. And so we were able to do that in their level 2 report, that basically it comes from natural sources. So one, if you're going to say natural background is the issue, you have to make sure you can prove natural background is the issue. Okay. So again, the word in the permit is sole. So is the natural background the sole reason you have an exceedances? And if you're contributing to it anyway, so in other words, if you have natural background, but also you're doing fabricating and you have that in the water, it's hard to make the argument that, well, it's just coming from natural background. So you have to really, you have to kind of prove your point. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Awesome. And we have a question saying, could you please list the more common pollutants or
More
contaminants? Yeah.
Well, in my experience, the most common pollutants are solids. I mean, that's the number one. I mean, solids and oil and grease. Those 2 are the most common ones I run across a lot. Also, iron. Of course, with iron is naturally occurring in the soil, and as we just talked about, it's going to be there. Unfortunately, sadly, if you have worked with copper at all, you're probably going to find copper in your water because it's in brake lining. It's all over the place. And I think it's unfortunate because the numeric action level for iron is 0.0332 milligrams per liter, which is extremely low. I mean, very low. And I know there's supposed to be science behind that number, though I'm still wondering why it has to be so low. For example, we have a town here in the Motherlode called Copperopolis. Well, what's in the ground? It's naturally occurring. So that's where we talked about natural background. If you can prove that your contaminants is coming solely from the natural background, then you can get exempted from it. Okay. But the most common ones, again, that I find are total suspended solids, oil and grease, and iron. And sometimes aluminum, but mostly total iron. Now, here's something also in the valley. We struggle with nitrates because even areas that don't have agriculture at one time probably did. And I find that nitrates take a long time for them to go away. And even if you don't have agriculture, you're surrounded by agricultural fields. And when the farmers dig up their fields, I mean, every fall we see them when they plow their fields, getting ready for the winter, and you have these huge plumes of smoke from the farm fields, and they come landing on your property. What that are all the fertilizers they planted in that ground. And so even if you don't have any fertilizers on you, because it's coming from the surrounding area, you can have what they call non-industrial source. So again, there is a way to prove that. But again, you have to prove it. You can probably do air deposition sampling, saying that's what we did for a client for Stockton. They were high on nitrates, and they really had no activities that their SIC code required nitrate sampling, but they didn't have any nitrates. So what we had to do was we had to do air deposition sampling, and we showed, look, this is coming from the air. There was a fertilizer facility further upwind from them, and it's coming on their property. It's coming on the water. It's coming on the runoff. They had some runoff too. We proved that it was coming from offsite sources, and so they are exempted from nitrates because we proved it wasn't them that was causing it, but you have to prove it.
Awesome. And we have a question from Danny that asked, how long can samples last on ice? Can we wait a few days after sampling to send off samples to the lab?
That is an excellent question. And the answer is depending on your sampling parameter. You have to look at the hold times. That's why if you don't know, get a hold of the lab and ask the lab themselves, whatever lab you have, what's the hold time for this? Some hold times are days. I know that certain metals, the hold time is 180 days. Whereas some parameters, the hold time is 48 hours. So you need to find out. So that's why some people, when they grab samples, if they grab samples on a Friday night and their lab's not open until Monday, it's going to exceed the hold time for some of those samples. And that's why the ELAP certified labs will do a hold time assessment of your sample. Is there anything over the hold time? So this is where you need to do your homework. Find out from the lab. If you don't know, find out what the hold time is for those sampling parameters and make sure that your samples are picked up and at the lab prior to the end of that hold time.
And one more question. Do you have any rule of thumb on how to locate upstream outfalls?
Upstream outfalls. Okay. By definition, an upstream isn't an outfall. By definition, upstream is before the water actually leaves your property. Okay. A rule of thumb, though. Okay, I think I understand what you mean by that. What you're saying is there, like I said earlier, if water goes to one spot and it's leaving, and that's where everything commingles, but yet you know you're having outside influences, what do? What you do is you try to trace back to where water is leaving your property. Okay, and it may not be feasible. There are many times it's not feasible where water comes from so many different places and it conglomerates into that one spot. And you really have no choice, but you're stuck with that one spot where you know it's being commingled. So if you can, I have one client where right now that's an issue, where they have commingling from off the street. And so they have this massive sump in their property. And what we recommend doing is putting a weir inside their massive sump that segregates their runoff from the runoff coming from the street. So that way, when we grab their samples, at least for a little while now, when the flow gets high, it's going to all commingle. But at least for the initial flow, when we grab the samples, it's going to be separated from the samples from the street. Now, the rule of thumb for upstreams, try to find a place where water leaves your property, but doesn't commingle with other stuff coming in, okay? Maybe you may have to do some infrastructure changes. You may have to do some things to modify your drainage, which it may be worth it. You say, well, there's some capital expense here. Yes, but if you end up getting samples that truly represent where you're going, then it may be worth you putting in maybe some utility boxes and making 2 sample points instead of 1. If that 1 sample point is causing you to have NEL exceedances, and especially once NELs get established in our area, if you could avoid that by grabbing upstream to where water comes from your facility and represents, and you grab samples from those, even up to 3 locations or 4, it depends. As long as it's feasible, again, you have to determine what's reasonable, feasible, given your constraints, your budget constraints, and your topography of your facility. Then you can do it. So again, rule of thumb, has to be water that represents your industrial area, leaving your industrial area, and before it commingles with outside influences. And how that works out, that's really something where it's on an individual basis. But I hope that helps a little bit. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Awesome. Well, looks like we don't have any more questions and we're just about out of time. So thank you, Aaron, for presenting today. Thank you everyone for attending. And again, you can watch all these workshops online and see the recorded version in about 24 to 48 hours. So thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoy the rest of Stormwater Awareness Week, and go ahead and contact Aaron if you have any questions, and that's his contact information. You can also find a contact form on our website that you can reach out to us and we'll get those questions over to Aaron. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed this, and those some awesome questions. Thank you all for the questions, and thank you, Rebecca, for all your help today.